Let's talk now about recording macros in Excel. The most important thing to understand about a macro is, what is the purpose of a macro? The purpose of a macro is pretty simple. We're trying to make life easier. The way we do that is because the macro will automate repetitive keystrokes. So the purpose of a macro is to automate repetitive keystrokes, which as a result is going to make our life easier. What does that mean? Well, if you find yourself in Excel doing the same thing over and over and over again, you can record those steps in a macro, and the next time you need to do them, instead of going through all those clicks and individually performing each step, you can instead simply run the macro, and Excel will automatically perform all of those steps for you. Now, we're going to go through a simple example, and here is what we want our macro to do. Before you can start writing a macro, you must understand exactly what that macro needs to do. In our case, here's what we need to do is we need to enter the months of January through December in cells A2 through A13. Then enter the years 2012, 2013, and 2014 in cells B1 through D1. We're going to write simple sum formulas in B14 through D14 that will add up the rows above them. We will format the years that we've entered into B1 through D1 in a bold font in a green color. We'll format the months that we entered in A2 through A13 in italics. We will format B2 through B13 in a yellow color, and then we're going to set up our worksheet for printing so that it will be centered vertically and horizontally, and it will fit to one page in length and width. So we have to assume this is something, and it may seem kind of silly with our example, but the assumption here is that this is something we have to do regularly. We have to do it 1 week after the other, maybe 1 month after the other. So we would like to automate that process so we don't have to do it every month. I'm going to go to sheet 2 in my workbook where we're going to actually perform these steps. Now, Excel makes it easy for us to record a macro if we go to the Developer ribbon and let's click Record Macro. We have to give our macro a name. I'm just going to call it Setup. We can give it a shortcut key, and I'll tell it just a lowercase s. That means if I were to come back and just press Control and then the lowercase s, that this macro would run automatically. We have to tell it where to store our macro. This one is going to relate to this particular workbook only, so we will store this macro in this workbook. And then we can give it a description. I'm going to skip that just to save a moment's time. Now notice I want you to see down here in the bottom left corner of my screen, it says a macro is currently recording. Click to stop recording. So right now, everything I do, be it right or be it wrong, is going to be written down in this macro. So let's go through the steps. We were in A2, supposed to enter January, and we need to go all the way down through December for that. So I can just click and drag. Remember, using my autofill function, Excel guessed that I just want to have all the months there. In B1, we're going to enter my 2012, C1 2013, and actually I could click and drag and have it enter my next year for me. We want to have formulas down here in B14 through D14 that are going to add up the rows above them. So I would simply use my AutoSum function, tell it which cells I want to add. I'm going to take that, drag it over to my 2 remaining cells also. My next step was to format the years in a bold font in the color green. Bold, and I'll pick a shade of green here. And then I'm going to format the months in italics. Then I'm going to set up this range, which is where I'm going to be recording my actual data, and I'm going to turn it yellow. Now, a macro can do whatever you tell it to do. These are the particular steps that we wanted our macro to go through. Now, we also wanted it to be able to print. Whenever it prints, we want to have it set up properly. So I'm going to go to my Margins tab and tell it to center it vertically and horizontally. Back to my page, I'm going to tell it to fit to 1 page in width by 1 page in length, and tell it OK. Those are all the steps I said that my macro needs to perform. So I'm going to come down here now, and I'm going to click this so it will stop recording my macro. Everything I've done has now been written down. Let's go back to Developer. Let's go to Macros, and you see my macro exists right here. I'm going to tell it to edit because I want us just to look and see what's in the macro. This is not user-friendly code necessarily, but usually we can look and figure out what it's doing. You can see right here, for example, in A2, I typed in January, and then I did some autofilling, copied it down. Then in B1, I typed in the year, and in C1, I typed in the next year, and so forth. I entered some formulas in B14, took those and copied over through D14 as well. Then I came back and did some formatting here. You see where I made it bold, came back and changed it to a particular color here. Here I selected these items, made them in italics, and I came back and changed the color here. We can look at it and we can also see where we told it to center things vertically and horizontally. For example, that's right here. And we also told it to fit to 1 page in width by 1 page in height. Now, you really don't have to go and look at this code, but I just wanted to show it to you that everything you just told Excel to do was written down in Visual Basic. If you had made some mistakes, guess what? They would be written down also. But we can look here and actually see and usually decipher to some degree the steps that my macro is actually going to perform. The next thing I would like to do is to show you how we could run that macro. Now I'm going to go to a new sheet in order to tell it to run the macro. I can go to Developer, and I'm going to go to Macros, and here it's pulling it up again. I'm going to tell it to run. And would you notice that just with that one click, everything that I told it to do when I record that macro was done for me automatically. I'm going to go to sheet 4. I could instead, remember we set up Control S as my shortcut. I just pressed Control and S on the keyboard. Every step that I told it to perform, it has now done for me. A whole lot easier than the first time when I had to go through and methodically do each step by itself. So the purpose of a macro is to automate repetitive keystrokes. Things that I would have to do on a regular basis, we can instead have recorded as a macro. We can also, to make life even simpler, we can insert a button. Insert button. I'm going to come up here and draw my button. I have to tell it what macro to assign to that button. I'm going to tell it to run the setup macro and tell it OK. So now I have a button. The problem is it only says button 2, which isn't very understandable, is it? So I can highlight that, get rid of my text, and type in something that makes sense. Click here to set up worksheet. I'm going to click away. Leave my mouse back over it. Notice it looks like the pointed hand right now. And now I'm going to click. And just by clicking that button, it automatically will execute the macro and carry out those steps that I have told it to perform. So the purpose of a macro is to automate repetitive keystrokes. Anything that you find yourself doing over and over again can be written down in a macro so that in the future when you need to perform those steps again, you don't have to do them one at a time. You can instead simply run the macro. To make it even simpler, you can insert a button to your worksheet, assign the macro to that button, and all you have to do is to click that one button and it will automatically execute the macro. A last step, which is very important, if we've recorded a macro in a workbook, we need to save that workbook in a special form so that the macro will be saved with it. When we go to save our workbook, we need to make sure we change the account type to be a macro-enabled workbook. If we save it this way, then our macro will be saved as part of that workbook. So we could say this is monthly workbook perhaps, but our type of file has to be a macro-enabled workbook instead of just a plain Excel workbook. If we save it just as a workbook, the macro will not be there. It will be gone. We must save it as a macro-enabled workbook if we want that macro to stay as a part of that workbook. And that is macros. The purpose being to automate repetitive keystrokes, therefore making our life easier in Excel.